In this lecture, we're going to take a look at some of the energetics required to run skeletal muscles when they're working. So I'm going to start with a situation. Chances are you cleared out some time, let's say it's an hour, and you're going to sit down and you're going to watch this lecture and you're going to think about it and take notes. During that hour, how many calories is your body going to spend to watch, process, and write? Maybe 80 calories, maybe 90 calories, something like that. Instead, let's assume that you decide, nope, I'm not going to watch the lecture right now. Instead, I'm going to go exercise vigorously for an hour. For somebody like me, that means running for 5 miles for an hour. How many calories do you think I'm going to spend if I'm running for 5 miles for an hour? 500, 600 calories? In other words, a lot more. Why do I spend so much more energy running versus sitting here and watching? And the answer is largely embedded in the fact that I'm utilizing my skeletal muscles a lot more during a run. And skeletal muscles are very energetically expensive when they're working over and over and over again, when you're doing twitches over and over again. So the universal or almost universal currency to fuel any sort of activity is ATP. And skeletal muscles also run predominantly on ATP. And we can think of ATP like cash. So I'm going to use this analogy as we kind of work through this lecture. So when you think of ATP, think of it like holding up, a $5 bill or something like that. Now, something I mentioned in a prior lecture, but it's worth mentioning again, is that even when you've been using your muscles over and over and over again, your ATP levels never fall drastically. So you can see that here in this graph, where you can see the ATP levels at rest and the ATP levels in a fatigued muscle are not that different. There are other changes that happen as your muscle fatigues. You can see that the amount of lactate, which is the same thing as lactic acid, increases. And then something called creatine and phosphocreatine changes. So PCR stands for phosphocreatine and CR is creatine. And you can see here that at rest, phosphocreatine is more common, and after a muscle has been fatigued, creatine is more common. And so we'll get into that in a little bit. All right, the first thing we're going to do is take a look at how does a skeletal muscle spend ATP? Why is it so energetically expensive? So the first thing I'd like you to do is actually pause this video and go back to your notes on excitation, contraction, coupling, and try to see where in those steps is the skeletal muscle actually burning through ATP. All right, my guess is that you came up with 2 answers, but there are actually 3 places where ATP is spent routinely in a working skeletal muscle. We'll go through the 2 that were explicitly stated in a prior lecture. Myosin cross bridges is probably your biggest ATP expense. In other words, it has the biggest bill in terms of how much ATP it takes to run a muscle fiber. And that is because every myosin head spends 1 ATP to do 1 cross bridge cycle. And there's lots of cross bridge cycles and lots of myosin heads. In addition, calcium ATPase is going to use ATP to directly pump calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The one that I did not explicitly state, but is implied, is the ubiquitous sodium-potassium pump. So why is the sodium-potassium pump so important here? Well, remember, skeletal muscle fibers are excitable. They run action potential, and in order to ensure that we have the correct resting membrane potential, in order to allow an action potential to occur, we need to have the sodium-potassium pump restoring our gradient. So after a series of action potentials, sodium has come into the cell, potassium has left the cell, and we have to restore those gradients to let future action potentials happen. All right, now that we've looked at how we spend money, we're going to spend the rest of the time looking at how we make money or how we replenish ATP, and then how we use different fuel sources depending on exercise intensity. The cell has some free ATP that is just sitting around. And this this is like you having cash in your wallet or in your mayonnaise jar or wherever you keep it. Chances are your entire net worth is not in your wallet in cash. I don't want to carry all of my money around in cash. And for reasons that I'm not going to get into, the cell actually takes kind of the same philosophical approach. It doesn't have very much ATP available to it at any one time. In other words, the ATP levels are tightly capped. You can't just have cash everywhere or ATP everywhere. It's like, no, it only likes to have a certain amount, and then it really won't go over that. And again, the reason why that is the case, I'm not getting into. It's beyond the scope of what we need. Suffice it to say, it's just like us. It doesn't want to keep all of its money in ATP. So how much ATP is in there? Enough to run about 10 twitches. So I want you to think about how long that's going to last you if you are looking at a fast twitch fiber. 10 twitches. Each twitch runs about 10 milliseconds, so that's 100 milliseconds. That's 1/10 of a second. 0.1 seconds. So in other words, not very long. Okay, so clearly the amount of free ATP in a cell is not going to get us very far. So the amount of cash in my wallet will not get me very far either. And so the same is true here. But when I make extra cash, you know what I like to do? I like to deposit it into my checking account. And then if I need cash, I'll go to the ATM with my debit card and draw it right back out. And the cell actually employs kind of a similar strategy. And that strategy is creatine. So definitely write down this chemical equation. It's a reversible equation that looks like this. You start with this molecule creatine. You do not need to know the chemical structure for my class. I just put it up there so you can see it because it's small. So you start with creatine. And when creatine and ATP combine, then the product is that we're going to take the third phosphate group off of ATP and shove it onto creatine. So it's really a transfer of phosphate groups. Remember that when we talk about the energy value of ATP, it's largely in that third phosphate group. So I'm basically taking what is valuable about ATP and transferring it to creatine. And so the resulting molecule is phosphocreatine. So you can see that here, there's the phosphate group attached to creatine and then ADP. This is generally a reversible reaction. When ATP levels get high in the cell, then ATP will combine with creatine to make phosphocreatine and ADP. When ATP levels start to fall because you're using ATP, then phosphocreatine takes that phosphate group and shoves it back onto ADP, thus making ATP. So in other words, when a cell is at rest, the reaction favors this direction, but when a cell is working and ATP levels drop, the reaction favors that direction. Just like when I have plenty of cash, you know what I do? I like to go to the ATM and put the extra cash in for a rainy day. And when I'm working and spending lots of money and my cash levels drop, then I want to go back to my ATM and draw it back out again. So creatine represents this really interesting approach to kind of acting as a buffer between our step one, which is just free cash, and our third and most sustained way of getting ATP, which is to use fuel, organic molecules, namely glucose and fatty acids. Now I'm going to come back to this creatine idea in a moment here, but I do want to briefly talk about the fact that most of your ATP is going to be generated by taking two fuel sources, or one or both of them, glucose and or fatty acids, and oxidizing them, such as glycolysis, aerobic respiration, and making a lot of ATP. So number 3 is really your way of continually generating ATP. Just like you need to go to work to keep making money. or you need to have some sort of employment or business or something to keep generating money. So when we think about this like an economy, you have your free cash. That's going to be step number 1 up here. Then you have the money that you've already earned, but you've stored it in your bank, and you can withdraw it pretty easily at any time as cash. That's number 2. And then if you want to make more money, you need to go to work, and that's going to be number 3. So I'm going to talk about the creatine thing just a little bit more, and then we're going to spend most of our time looking at number 3. So this is an image from the textbook that basically shows what's happening and how this is a reversible reaction. If you are at rest, then extra ATP that you make will combine with creatine and make ADP and phosphocreatine. So phosphocreatine is a storage form of ATP. And as soon as your ATP levels start to drop, the reaction reverses. The favorability is towards the other direction. That is, extra phosphocreatine combines with ADP and creates creatine. Now, interestingly enough, the enzyme that does this is actually attached to your M line on your skeletal muscle fibers. You don't need to know this for my test, but I think it's really fascinating. Of course it is, right? Like, where is your biggest ATP need? It's going to be myosin, right? So why not put the enzyme that can grab phosphocreatine and any free ADP that's been spit out by a myosin head and recombine them to make fresh ATP right next to the myosin? That makes perfect sense. So I thought that was really cool that you actually have that enzyme that runs a chemical reaction sticking out of the M line, ready to just like grab any available phosphocreatine and ADP and make new ATP. So at rest, a cell will generate about 10 times as much phosphocreatine as free ATP. So that might last you a full second in a contracting muscle. And then everything else is going to need to be done by metabolizing organic molecules. All right, before we go, just want to summarize my analogy and how I think about phosphocreatine as like it could be cash, but it's sitting in a checking account. It just needs to be drawn out with a debit card. And now we get to how we can sustainably generate ATP, and that is to oxidize fuel. We have 2 major sources of fuel that the muscle fiber will use: glucose and fatty acids. Almost all cells in the body will use glucose as a fuel source. Not all cells will use fatty acids as a fuel source, but skeletal muscles actually prefer it under certain circumstances. So, when we talk about oxidizing, I mean that we're taking the nonpolar covalent bonds between carbon-carbon or carbon-hydrogen and we're breaking them, and we're capturing the energy that is released to phosphorylate ADP and make ATP. So one way that we could do this, for instance, is aerobic respiration, right? Which is pretty long and lengthy and requires oxygen, but we'll get at least 34 ATP per glucose molecule. So I'm going to look at these independently and then talk about benefits and disadvantages of each potential option. Okay, let's start with glucose. If we oxidize glucose, we're probably going to do it in a pathway known as glycolysis. And it's a 10 or 11-step pathway. And the end product of glycolysis is pyruvate. Now, glycolysis by itself yields 2 ATP. Once we get to the end of glycolysis and we have our pyruvate molecules, what can we do? Well, if oxygen is available, then it can get shuttled into the mitochondria and it can be further broken down into carbon dioxide, and we capture all of that energy and eventually get quite a bit of ATP, like maybe 32 additional ATP. But it's long, meaning it takes a long time, and it requires oxygen. If we don't have oxygen, then we're stuck doing glycolysis in combination with lactic acid fermentation. So lactic acid fermentation by itself does not produce any additional ATP, but it is a necessary step that is required if you want to keep doing glycolysis in the absence of oxygen. So lactic acid fermentation and glycolysis go together. The net is 2 ATP and it's anaerobic, meaning it doesn't require any oxygen. Alternatively, we can shuttle pyruvate into the mitochondria, and then through many, many more steps, we get 32 ATP. But this process takes quite a bit longer. How much longer? About 100 times longer than glycolysis. So this is a much longer process and it requires oxygen. So are there ever times where maybe oxygen is available, but the cell will choose to just do lactic acid fermentation and glycolysis? And the answer is yes. But we'll look at that example in a little bit. Let's now turn and take a look at fatty acids. Fatty acids have a lot more nonpolar covalent bonds and therefore are capable of generating a lot more ATP. How much ATP is generated by a fatty acid really depends on the length of the fatty acid. The more nonpolar covalent bonds there are, the more ATP is generated. Fatty acids are only metabolized aerobically. Moreover, the process of breaking a fatty acid down is incredibly long, much longer than even breaking glucose down. So oxidizing a fatty acid is the slowest way to get ATP, but it gives you the biggest yield. If you've taken a nutrition class, you probably know that fats or lipids tend to have about 9 kilocalories per gram, whereas sugars only have 4 kilocalories of energy per gram. In other words, a gram of fat is twice as energetic or has twice as much energy in it as a gram of glucose. And the reason is because fatty acids are almost all nonpolar covalent bonds, and those are the high energy bonds. So when you break down a fatty acid, it makes sense that you would get twice as much ATP or more because it has twice as much energy in it. But it also requires oxygen. There's no anaerobic way to metabolize it, and it's very slow. So now that we've covered the sources of fuel that we can use and the way that we can use them to generate ATP, let's take a look at some different situations where we would prefer fatty acids, or maybe we would prefer glucose metabolized anaerobically. So let's take a look at the benefits of each type of fuel source and the way that it's yielded. I'm going to start with glucose. Assume I have 10 glucose molecules and I am going to metabolize them anaerobically. And what that means is I'm going to use glycolysis in combo with lactic acid fermentation. Now, if that's the case, I know that each glucose molecule is going to give me 2 ATP. So what is my overall ATP yield for my 10 glucose molecules? And you can see here that it would be 20 ATP. That's not a big yield, but the benefit is I get those ATP very quickly. If we were to assume, and this is completely hypothetical, that glycolysis takes 5 milliseconds, then the total amount of time that it takes to get 20 ATP is only 50 milliseconds, or 1/20th of a second. So this gives me a very rapid burst of ATP, but I've burned through all of my glucose with just a meager 20 ATP to show for it. So now let's consider that I process my 10 glucose molecules aerobically. So now I'm going to use aerobic respiration. This requires that I have access to sufficient amounts of oxygen, but I get 34 ATP per glucose instead of 2. Which means that when I process these 10 glucose molecules, I'm going to have 340 ATP. That's a lot more money, but it's going to take me a lot longer. If glycolysis only took 5 milliseconds and aerobic respiration takes 100 times longer, then aerobic respiration would take 500 milliseconds. Times 10 glucose, that's 5 seconds. That's considerably longer. So yep, I get a bigger yield, but at the expense of time. Fatty acids, which must be metabolized aerobically, provide the biggest yield per molecule, but the process takes the longest. So if I assume that each fatty acid shown gives me 100 ATP, then the 4 fatty acids will give me collectively 400 ATP. But the process takes considerably longer than metabolizing even glucose aerobically. Let's say it takes 1.5 seconds. Then it's going to take me 6 seconds to metabolize these 4 fatty acid molecules. We've now seen that the skeletal muscle can use fuel 3 different ways. Each method and source has its own benefit but also disadvantage. So which one a skeletal muscle fiber prefers really depends on what the pressing needs are of that skeletal muscle fiber. Exercise intensity can be assessed by something called percent of maximum heart rate. Now, your maximum heart rate is probably around 200 beats per minute if you're under the age of 30. So 50% of maximum heart rate would be 100 beats per minute. And your heart rate might be 100 beats per minute if you're walking briskly. So that's a pretty low intensity exercise regime. But let's say that you get on a bicycle and you start pedaling pretty hard and your heart rate goes up to 150 beats per minute. That's a higher exercise intensity, and that's measured as 75% of your maximum heart rate. If you tried sprinting, your heart rate might approach 190 beats per minute, and that would be 95% of your max heart rate. So exercise intensity can be assessed with percent of max heart rate. Let's start with 50% of your maximum heart rate. This is like a brisk walk. How long can you hold a brisk walk for? Probably longer than you can hold a sprint for. So your body is working, but at this point, it's prioritizing efficiency. It's trying to maximize its ATP yield from its fuel sources. So therefore, it's going to predominantly use oxygen, which if you're only at 50% of your maximum heart rate, there should be plenty of oxygen delivered to your cells. It's going to predominantly use oxygen to metabolize fuel sources aerobically. And since fatty acids give you more ATP than glucose, it will have a slight preference for fatty acids. So at this low intensity, you're not burning through your ATP too quickly, and therefore your muscle fibers can afford to wait for the lengthy processes of aerobic respiration for glucose and aerobic metabolism of the fatty acids. And so the priority is on maximizing your ATP yield, and you have the time and you have the oxygen to wait for it. On a cardio machine, this is sometimes referred to as the fat burning zone. Now, if you increase your intensity to 75%, you're not going to last as long, and your ATP expenditure per second is going to be higher, which means you need to replace your ATP a lot faster. Because aerobic yields will still give you so much more ATP than anaerobic yields, you're still going to try to use aerobic respiration or aerobic metabolism of fats whenever possible. But you're going to start doing more of your glucose metabolism anaerobically as your intensity increases. So most of your fuel at this point is glucose, which both ways are faster than fatty acids. And even though much of it will be aerobic, some of it will be anaerobic. And the percentage of ATP from fats drops considerably. When your exercise intensity increases to a sprint, your muscle fibers are burning through ATP at the highest rate and therefore must replenish ATP at the highest rate. The fastest replenishment of ATP comes from anaerobic metabolism of glucose, glycolysis, and lactic acid fermentation. In this case, you don't need oxygen. You don't need to wait for oxygen, and you'll get your ATP right now, but at a major cost. First of all, you're going to generate a lot of lactic acid, which will contribute to fatigue. Secondly, you're going to burn through all of your glucose. You don't have an unlimited supply of glucose in your cells. And if you burn through it all just to get 2 measly ATP per glucose, but you get your glucose right now, you're not going to have any reserve. And so at this intensity, you cannot sustain your output for very long before you exhibit rapid fatigue. All right, that concludes this lecture where we looked at how exercise intensity is going to dictate the preferred fuel source of muscle fibers. In our last lecture on muscle physiology, we'll look at fatigue and ways that we change our muscle mass.